Hello, everybody. Welcome into what is very quickly becoming a Thursday staple around here on the Dog Nation video channels is our Cover 4 broadcast. My name is Brandon Adams. Happy to be with you alongside the rest of our Dog Nation team, Mike Griffith, Connor Riley, and our Dog Nation recruiting insider, Jeff Sintel. We've got a very busy show that we're going to put together for you, of course, the next hour. A lot of this is going to include your comments and really three different topics today that we're going to hit. We're going to start with some names on the Georgia roster who we expect to have the potential of being breakout stars for Georgia this season. Now, I'll find out from Connor, Jeff, and Mike what their definition of breakout is on this. But I'm thinking about guys who really step up in a big way, do more than just be solid contributors, the kinds of players that could potentially be household names around the SEC and potentially among the college football world. I'll look forward to hearing from our Dog Nation team on that. And as I said, you in the comment section there as well. Then we're going to sort of step back and take a look at the Georgia schedule and the rest of the SEC. We'll give you some names to know for some of Georgia's opponents this season and close things out with our over-under picks for each of the other SEC schools. So a nice look at what Georgia needs to do to take a big step forward here in 2020 and how they fit into the rest of the SEC picture over the course of our broadcast here today. Guys, before we get going, any early thoughts here to kind of get us started?
Hey, Brandon, right. How is everybody, man?
Dynamite drop in as always. Go ahead, Jeff.
Trying to give some of the gentlemen the honors on the tee here, but I think Connor had a good joke about my background. He said there's as many people in the Rose Bowl behind me as there might be this season in the state of California. You guys can guffaw and spit out the chocolate milk out of your noses, whatever as you want to do this. But it's interesting, Brandon. I like your first topic, man. I kind of wonder how each and every one of us will view breakout differently.
Yeah, my thing on this is, Connor, that we're talking about real breakout stars here. This isn't, with all due respect to role players, this isn't role player and expanded role to me. This is guy ready to take the kinds of leaps we've seen DeAndre Baker take in this program, although admittedly he was really good in 2017, crossing over to 2018. The leap that Roquan Smith took from a 95 tackle season in 2016 to a Butkus Award in 2017. When I think about breaking out, those are the kinds of step-ups that I think about for Georgia.
So, like, if I could give, like, a baseline here, like, they have to have a better season than this. Like, George Pickens last year, I would say, was a breakout player for Georgia. Would that be fair in your statement?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, by the end of the year, this was a guy that pretty much everybody knew about. In fact, the aftermath of the Sugar Bowl, you've seen him written about a lot. That's a guy that if we're doing this show in Starkville, Mississippi today, the Mississippi State fan, I think, knows who George Pickens is. He's paying attention to the rest of the SEC, where there are a lot of guys in the Georgia roster that not necessarily famous in the other outposts around the SEC. Mike, does that description make sense to you?
Yeah, I thought maybe Matt Rule was the only one that didn't know who George Pickens was by the time the Sugar Bowl was played. I mean, my goodness, he had 11 catches in the first half. But, yeah, I understand guys elevating to the point where, fans from other schools would be able to identify them with Georgia. Now, they may not elevate to the status that Jake Fromm was, and I won't use that four-letter word that sends Michael Carvel into hysterics, but everybody recognized who Jake Fromm was and who he played for. Who could be the next guys that are quickly and easily recognized from other fan bases from Georgia, right?
And I'll give you one quick thought on this, and then, Mike, I want you to kick us off here. If you look at LSU a year ago, I think they're very interesting in this regard. Huge draft class, 14 players selected overall, 10 in the first 3 rounds. But arguably, you can make a case that just below Joe Burrow, the next best players in the team were not draft-eligible players. Derrick Stingley may have been the best defensive back in America, even though Grant Delpit, for the most part, was honored that way. Jamar Chase was the Blitnikoff Award winner for nation's best wide receiver, but he was also a sophomore as well. So if we're thinking about the true best players in the Georgia roster, they don't necessarily have to be juniors, seniors. The big breakout guys can be from those freshman, sophomore ranks. We saw that from LSU a year ago in the case of Chase and Stingley. So with that in mind, Mike, why don't you give us your breakout name, and we'll kick it around, debate it here a bit.
Yeah, I wrote about him last night, and, gosh, guys, we've been talking about James Cook for a couple of years, and it just, we asked Kirby Smart about it last year, and he said, it wasn't that they didn't want to go to him. It was just Jake Fromm was taking what the defense was given. Now, I don't know about you, but I thought there were plenty of times when James Cook was open in the flats and Jake Fromm kept his eyes downfield and didn't really look to him as an option. Now, this offense is going to be different. I think it's going to be more West Coast. I think it's going to be more high efficiency. And I think you're going to see more of those dump-off passes, and the whole idea is to get the ball to explosive players in space. I didn't think Georgia did a very good job with that last year, partially because they weren't able to stretch the field vertically. I think they're going to be able to do that better, and that's going to open things up for James Cook to catch that little pass in the flats and do some special things with it. We know he's had a strong offseason. He's a junior. He's likely looking at this as 1 year and then the NFL. So I think James Cook is a guy whose time could finally come, in part because he's matured and become a better practice player, as Kirby Smart told us, but also in part because of the type of offense that he's going to be working in this season.
Connor, I want to get a thought from you about what Mike had to say. I do think that Todd Monken's more equipped to get the best out of James Cook than James Coley probably was a year ago. Cook just kind of feels like he'd fit in well to a Todd Monken offense. However, if we're going to define breakouts as among the best players in the roster and the kind of player that is famous around the rest of the SEC, if not the rest of the country, admittedly, Cook probably falls just below that standard for me, and that's partially due to the fact that it's a crowded backfield at Georgia. I expect a bigger year from Samir White. I think I expect a bigger year from Kendall Milton than what I'm assuming that Cook brings to the table. How does the name Cook land for you in terms of the kind of breakout criteria that we're looking for here?
Yeah, I don't see him as Georgia's leading rusher this year. I don't see him as Georgia's leading receiver. I could certainly see a world where he's a very dangerous weapon and a name that a lot of people know about. But I don't think he's going to be the first, second, or third name that opponents worry about and say, all right, we got to figure out how we're going to stop this guy during the 2020 season. But I could certainly see him expanding on a role where he's shown flashes from time to time of being a potential threat as both a receiver and as a runner out of the backfield this coming season.
Jeff, let me make an odd comparison for a moment. Do you think that Cook for Georgia this year could be as impactful as a player at a different position Jalen Waddell was for Alabama in 2018, where there were three receivers who were probably ahead of him in the pecking order, deep running game, and yet the slot receiver Waddle was, I think, a load to deal with. I think that opposing defensive coaches spent hours game planning against how you stop a Waddle. Is there a chance that Cook could be that impactful for Georgia this season? Because that, to me, is what breakout looks like.
Yeah, I guess my version of the topic is somebody that goes from a waiting in the wings guy, or it's a his turn guy, to a guy that's going to show up on all SEC ballots. And I don't know if, especially when you name Jalen Waddle, I don't know if I think that comparison happens. You know, a lot of people think that, okay, the depth chart has cleared its way for James Cook to shine this year, and they dabble in a little bit of hocus pocus in terms of the new offense. And I do think those 2 points have merit, but I think that takes James Cook from where he's been at Georgia to maybe 800, 900 all-purpose yards at Georgia, that type of guy, maybe even 7-8 touchdowns. For me, I don't know if James Cook becomes that player in his kind of drop the mic and get to the NFL type season. If he was truly that type of guy for whatever reason, maybe we would have seen more of him last year when Brian Herrien was in the way at the same time. So when I think of that guy that goes from way off stage to maybe center stage or one of the three rings of the Georgia football team circus, I don't see James Cook as that guy. I see him as a moving to a very solid contributor type base.
Jeff, we'll let you give your name in a moment. Mike, one more thing on this before we move on. Is Cook your pick to be the leading rusher for UGA?
No, not at all. I see him as more of a third down back. I see him as a guy like Alvin Kamara emerged at Tennessee. I think he had 1,200 total yards. I think Cook is a candidate to be a return specialist as well as a third down back. I think the primary carries will be split between Samir White and Kenny McIntosh. We have to wait and see how Kendall Milton fits in at the SEC level. But I see Cook as a contributor, a guy that you throw to out of the backfield. Sometimes he motions out of the backfield, lines up in the slot, a guy you want to get the ball to in space because he was a five-star South Florida guy with a lot of speed and open field running ability. So I don't necessarily look to him to be the leading rusher BA, but I do think he's going to be a constant weapon that will be a big part of the game plan this year.
Let me get a few of our Facebook comments here. Zach Smith excited about the idea of Darnell Washington. Andrew Ray says people will laugh at me, but I think that Matt Landers could thrive in a Todd Monken offense. Vaughn Jackson says we are high because James Cook's going to be one of the reasons that UGA wins it all. So there you go. Michael Hayes also talking about Darnell Washington. And a lot of good comments coming in. Chris Slim White says, I can't believe that me and Mike agreed on something. So apparently he likes the pick of James Cook there as well. We're off and running here on our Cover 4 broadcast today. A lot of SEC-related topics to get to in a moment. We're talking about potential breakout names for Georgia right now. And I heard a good one there from Mike with James Cook. Jeff Sintel, how about you? Who's the name you want to give us here?
Yeah, there's a bunch. Little side road on that topic is I would probably, if I had to pick a breakout back, I would probably pick McIntosh, the guy that Mike mentioned in his earlier comments. But for me, man, there's so many guys to do that, and I don't think that, to me, I think all the juice we're seeing out of Morrie Salyer is good, and I think that was coming, but he's not my name for this category. My name for this category is Lewis Cine. I think he's going to play as well as J.R. Reed did in 2017. You noticed last year, you heard last year how Richard LeCount, Richie, and both J.R. Reed were at the same time peppering folks with information that they knew Lewis was the next man up, and they knew that they were quietly walking him over saying, do you understand this? Do you see this the way I do? Do you prepare the way I do right now? Because this is going to be your job next year. And you look at Cine, he's an athletic upgrade over both Reed and just from a size and impact ability. He's every bit the athlete that Richard LeCount is, except he's 6'2" and about 205 pounds, 210 pounds. So I look at a guy that can vault from somewhere, not even as a starting spot last year, to a potential all-SEC name on the ballot. And I like Lewis Cine in that category.
Yeah, Cine's an interesting name for me too, Mike. And Marshall Fleming in our Facebook comment section also brought that name up as well. And Mike, for me, I'll put him in the category of Morrie Salyer from the standpoint of we're going to see both these players this season playing more expanded role, what we saw from them a year ago. And yet I've got great confidence in both these guys, both in terms of their mental makeup. Cine was one of the most often predicted players to do well as a freshman when he got a chance to play last season. I think he lived up to that billing. Salyer's one of those guys that's been, probably buried in the depth chart a bit behind some players who may have been just a little bit more ready to play when they first arrived at UGA. And yet the confidence that Jeff expresses in Cine, I can almost express that same level of confidence for the other name that he brings up in Morrie Salyer. I got no problem with both those players, Cine included, who Jeff just spent some time talking about. I got no problem with him whatsoever in an expanded role this upcoming season.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it either. The reason I would bet against it is more because of the competition and the other options. I mean, this Georgia secondary is so stacked. I keep thinking about guys like Devod Wilson and Tyreek Stevenson getting on the field. I know how Kirby and Lanning like to mix and match personnel depending on the teams that they're playing. And it's such a physical league. And Jeff, you brought up the point yourself that he's just not as big as Richie LeCount. And if there's an issue or a question I have about Lewis Cine, it's his ability to come up and be physical in the run game. He didn't really have to do that against Baylor. I'm not sure how much he'll really have to do that game in and game out. But the thing that struck me when I interviewed him in the Sugar Bowl locker room was that he was very slight, and he didn't look like a guy that could make it as a consistent 6 to 10 tackle a game safety in the SEC. So I think there'll be some platooning there. I do think he'll be the starter. I think he'll be the primary safety, but I don't think he'll be an all-SEC type this season.
I think, well, to my point there, Brandon and Mike, I look at Cine. I think he was 6'2", 205, 210 coming out of high school. I think Cine is one of the more physical players on the Georgia roster. The way he runs the alley in high school, that was the one thing that he did coming out of the gate, where he was going to do immediately at Georgia. He would run the alley and he would deliver the blow and deliver contact. I don't know if he's per se, when I was making that comparison, I don't know if he's the pure athlete that Richard LeCount is, because I've seen Richard LeCount rip off 6 or 7 backflips in a row after making a one-handed interception before. But I think Cine is physically every bit the size and length, some of those Alabama-type safeties that we've seen in the past. And, Brandon, you did mention Salyer. I just want to give a quick shout-out on the broadcast. He's down to 315 pounds. Our Connor Riley put this up on the Dog Nation site today. I can't think of any Georgia tackle that is weighed that slight and already at 315 pounds. And let's face it, folks, he's been combine training alongside Andrew Thomas this whole time. Morrie Salyer's been working like he was trying to get drafted this year, this entire spring. So that's only going to bode well for what I think might be his final season in Athens this fall.
And he does does look much better than he did a month ago, I thought, in the training with Andrew. I think that this is a movement in general, BA. I think that one of the things we're going to see with this Todd Monken, Matt Luke offense, and I say Matt Luke because I think he's integral. I think this offensive line, I think we're going to see them move away. I don't think they're ever going to be small, but I don't think the 330 and 345 Goliaths is exactly the optimal size for these guys. I expect a little bit more mobile offensive line that can, be effective out in space blocking, so you can see a little bit more of those runs on the perimeter with pulling guards and tackles that can move well.
Yeah, Mike, you might be right about that. But Connor, back to the point of Scene for a moment. I know you're like me, going back to some of those high school highlights. Scene was a real thumper, big hitter going back to his high school career. And that's something from him at the next level. And by next level, I mean expanded role for this upcoming season. Can't wait to see hopefully a lot of that from him this year.
Right. You think back to that LSU game, he was, I think, the big wrinkle that Georgia threw in there to try and slow down that LSU offense. And while it largely didn't work that day, I thought Scene did do some nice and impressive things that day. And I thought he played pretty well in that Baylor game. So I think there's a lot of reason for warranted optimism about having a guy like Scene to pair with a guy like LeCount.
And Jeff, the other thing I'll add to this on the subject of these safeties before we move on, Mike mentioned the idea of rotation. We certainly saw that a lot last year at the cornerback position. For the most part, it seemed like LeCount and Reed were always the safeties. Didn't seem like we saw as much rotation at the safety position. Do you think that Scene potentially occupies a similar role for Georgia this year, where he's kind of a set-it-and-forget-it player? You put him out there and you don't necessarily take him off the field as much because of how constant LeCount and Reed were a year ago?
Yeah, I think so. Because, one thing about Lewis is he's a really smart fella, too. I think he can pick up the nuances of the Kirby Smart defense and what Charlton Morin wants him to do. And I remember that play. Who remembers that play got wiped away by some laundry on the field? But remember that play he made where he came away with a fumble early in that game, and he almost basically played a wrecking ball to Kirby Smart on the sidelines and toppling him over. I think you're going to see a lot more highlights from Lewis Scene out of that. And, he's a guy that he looks more prototype NFL size to me. And the thing I'm curious about, and then the rotation angle, is who becomes the rotating safeties? Who becomes that guy? Is it Tyreek Stevenson moving over? Mark Webb moving over? Is Mark Webb staying out on the edge? Devad Wilson? If you followed some of that Instagram chatter, which is probably, Brandon, more reliable than that online chatter you look at sometimes, you have these players touting on some chats on their Instagram that a guy like Wilson will be working at safety, and as well as a guy like Tyreek Stevenson will be working at both the star and the safety for Georgia. So very interesting. And folks, I'm going to make Brandon want to go punch a hole in his drywall behind his kitchen right now. But I think you could look at the name Keely Ringo as a guy that might get some reps at safety and also the star position too.
That's interesting. That's very, very interesting names. Good stuff so far. Connor, how about a breakout name from you?
All right, I'm personally thrilled that I'm picking third on the board here, and the guy I want is still available. Obviously, my heart wants me to pick Dominic Blaylock, but with the ACL injury and the new offense, I just can't do that. Along with what a new offense and sharing with Pickens, I just don't know what that offense is totally going to look like and what his production would have to look like. I think he could be sort of in that, second 700, 800-yard receiver mold. But until we sort of see him on the field and see him recovered completely from that ACL injury, I just can't pull the trigger on that. Jeff mentions Trayvon Walker. That's a nice name and a name I've certainly thought about. But the guy I'm going with as a stone cold lock breakout player is one Obie Dean. I think when you match, the thing that comes to mind first isn't his athleticism, which we'll get to shortly. The thing everyone talks about there is his functional football intelligence, along with his 4.0 GPA off the field. And I think, he's someone who's probably the favorite to step in for Tay Crowder and take on that starting linebacker role opposite Monty Rice. And I think Dean is a guy who, when you add in his athletic profile, I'm not saying he's going to become Roquan Smith, but I think you could see him make that similar sort of leap that Smith made his sophomore year, to where he goes from, Dean actually had a better freshman campaign than Smith did. And I think you could see him take a similar leap to where, okay, just about everyone in the SEC knows who this is.
Yeah, Jeff, I will say that Obie Dean is my name as well, for the reasons that we established to start this conversation. If we're looking at breakout as being someone who's a star, someone who's well-known amongst other fans outside the bubble of Dog Nation. I think that Dean may be the most likely name. For me, it was going to be one of three guys. I think that Connor mentioned them all. It was going to be Nolan Smith. It was going to be Trayvon Walker. It was going to be Nakobe Dean. The reason why I go Dean just barely over Nolan Smith, over Trayvon Walker, in the case of Smith, it's a crowded situation at outside linebacker where you can make a case for Ojulari, you can make a case maybe even for Jermaine Johnson. Nolan Smith may be the best of that group, but it's not obvious right now. In the case of Trayvon Walker, Walker may end up being Georgia's best defensive lineman by the end of the season, but you're projecting just a little bit by saying that. The point that Connor brought up that I think needs to be hammered home remains to be seen if Nakobe Dean finishes his career in the same category of Roquan Smith. But it's not an overstatement to say that he was better as a freshman probably than Roquan was in 2015, or maybe better said, just a little bit farther along as a player. Georgia's very deep at the inside linebacker spot. The fact that Dean leapt ahead of guys who've been in the program longer, established himself ahead of other really good linebackers who were part of the 2019 class with him. That's all very, very impressive stuff. And if I'm looking for that breakout name, I think Connor picked the right name. Jeff, I do believe it's Nakobe Dean.
The one thing I see there, though, Brendan, is like everybody's got somebody blocking them to greatness. I mean, do we think that Nakobe Dean will perform better than Monte Rice as Georgia's inside linebacker to know?
I think they're on the field together is what I think.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, but what I mean is who's going to be that inside linebacker that wreaks havoc, or the one that everybody identifies as that's the tackling machine for Georgia? I see Trayvon Walker, maybe he doesn't have a guy in front of him, whereas you guys made the point astutely about Nolan and Aziz and also Jermaine Johnson. When I look at the Georgia defense, I look at my point when I was seeing is there's really nobody in his way to becoming not just the starter, but also kind of one of those identifiable names at the SEC in this position. And it makes it really tough when you go to the Georgia's defense, because if we all had a 10-second answer to this question, who's the most likely all SEC performer on the Georgia defense? That'd be a pretty tough question. I guess I would probably lean towards Monty Rice or maybe Eric Stokes.
Mike, I want you to weigh in on this. I guess part of this for me is a personal bias of man, I'm excited about the possibility, with all due respect to the guys in the secondary, that the best player in the Georgia defense this season would come from the front seven. I think that's a more dynamic version of what we'll all agree is an incredibly talented Georgia defense. But the most dynamic version of that defense is to have the star player, the household name, emerge from that either defensive line or linebacking core. That, to me, is the Georgia defense at its best if it is a guy like Dean or a guy like Nolan or a guy like Trayvon Walker.
Yeah, I think they're going to be pretty spectacular up front. Or Aziz Ojulari, let's not forget about him, or Malik Carrington. They have got some stars in the front seven, and that's something that Georgia hasn't had. They have not been on the level with Clemson and Alabama in their defensive front seven, and now they are. Lewis Seen, by the way, he's listed at 6'1", 185. I mean, when I interviewed the guy, he really didn't look big, Jeff. So I don't know where he gained the 20 pounds. Georgia hasn't recognized it on their updated roster. But as far as Nakobe Dean goes, BA, he was on the field on third downs consistently. And the thing that's even more impressive is this is a guy that was playing with a high ankle sprain. And when I had an opportunity to interview him after the SEC game, and the reason we point out when is because freshmen aren't available unless it was the SEC championship game or the Sugar Bowl. Nakobe told me he didn't even feel 100% until mid-October, and still he was on the field. So I think, to Jeff's point, Monty Rice probably will be the tackling machine that's plugging the gaps. But I see Nakobe as a guy that can blitz. I think he's their best linebacker in coverage. As more and more teams spread you out and play in space, he's going to be more and more valuable. So while maybe he's not the guy stuffing the A-gap, he's the guy chasing down the backs and the flats. I really like Nakobe Dean as the breakout player on defense, more so than Lewis Seen.
All right, so Connor, since you mentioned Dean, I want to read to you what James Crump says in our Facebook comment section. He thinks it's unfair that Nolan Smith was overlooked here. I gave my case for why I took Dean over Smith, and for me it's all about the fact that I'm not quite so sure that Nolan Smith's distinguished himself amongst the rest of those outside linebackers the way that I think that Nakobe Dean's on the verge of doing with his crew there on the inside. Why did you take Dean over Nolan?
I think there's less competition at the top of the depth chart. And from what we've seen at that jack position, there's a lot more scenarios where Georgia had 2 off-ball inside linebackers on the field last year than it did where it had Nolan Smith and Azeez Ojulari on the field together. And Azeez Ojulari is a really – not that Amani Rice isn't a really good player. He is. But Azeez Ojulari is a really good player, and I think there's a reason that he led the team in sacks last year and was the team's best pass rusher. And I think having that sort of in front of him at literally the exact same position, unless they're going to start playing Nolan Smith at that Sam spot, which I don't think they're going to, and that Sam spot goes away when they go into sort of their money packages. I don't expect to see, to Jeff's point, I do think there's a little bit more roadblocks in the way for Nolan getting onto the field consistently enough. Whereas, as Mike correctly brings up, Obie Dean played a lot on third down, and I expect that to continue. And now with Tate Crowder not sort of blocking his path, I think we're going to see more of Dean on first and second down as well.
So let me just make one more point on this topic before we change the subject and look at some of the teams that Georgia's going to play this upcoming season. Mike mentions an offensive guy in James Cook. Jeff takes defense with Lewis Seen. Connor and I both took the same name with Obie Dean. My other candidates to be selected were also defensive names. I mentioned Nolan Smith. I mentioned Trayvon Walker. I'm guessing if I make Connor make another pick other than Dean, I'm guessing he would have taken a defensive name there as well. Where does that leave us then looking at the Georgia offense when so far very much on brand, the leading candidates to be the breakouts seem to be by a margin of at least 3-1 on the basis of our picks, defense as opposed to offense. Jeff, why don't you start that? Where do things stand with the Georgia offense? And if I forced you to look at that breakout guy on offense, where are you going for that?
I would just kind of look at a new receiver. You would have to be a new receiver, kind of like who can be the Pickens of last year. I don't know about the other gentlemen on the panel, but I would just wonder about how much in sync the offense is going to be when you think they don't get on campus together until July 15th. I know they've zoomed it to death, but I feel that really the way players learn is on the field with mental reps, going over and over and over and drilling it against some very good competition, especially when you're installing a new scheme, a new system. You're going to have new offensive linemen. You're going to have a new quarterback. I think the variables there are in play where you might not see the crispness on offense, or especially during the special teams packages that we might have expected in the past. I think the name for me, Jermaine Burton. I say this a lot, but if you're looking at a breakout guy, I think Jermaine Burton can supply the stats that maybe a George Pickens did a year ago.
Mike, how about Jeff's point on that? I'm a big believer that brilliance and simplicity are synonymous. In other words, you demonstrate how smart you are by how simple you're capable of making things. I want to see Todd Monken employ a simple offense that can be easily instituted over the course of what might be a very different offseason here for Georgia. How much do you think this new Georgia offense, at least new coordinator, new quarterback, how much do you think that that's impaired by the fact that they have been spending so much time away from each other?
Well, to your point, BA, the genius is in the simplicity, and I've seen that over and over with some championship teams I've covered. And, even Mark Richt today, when I asked him that specific question, how hard will it be for a first-year offensive coordinator to work with Jamie Newman? He said, RPO is pretty simple. So there is a lot of simplicity to that scheme. It's a pretty simple read offense. The question becomes, to Jeff's point, and I think all of us, is what kind of timing can Jamie Newman possibly have downfield with these receivers when there's such an abbreviated preparation time? And that was what led me to my pick of James Cook in the flats and the short controlled pass game. So, I think Jermaine Burton is a fantastic candidate, particularly because I'm not convinced we're going to see George Pickens for 12 full games. I got to see it to believe it. Has the leopard changed spots? Is there going to be another suspension? We have to wait and see how he is, grown in the program. There's going to be a lot of DBs that are going to be baiting him all year long. Everybody's going to know he's got a short fuse, and until I see it, I won't believe it that he can get through the season without a half a game suspension or an ejection. So that could open the door for a Burton. Connor mentioned Kenny McIntosh earlier as a running back. Looking at Todd Monken's offense with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Jaquez Rogers was the running back that I would most liken to Cook, by the way. But he liked to use his tight ends. BA, a name that you brought up quite a lot, and I'm surprised you didn't mention him yet. Could it be Trey McKitty? I mean, could he come in and be an impact player? Again, I see a West Coast offense coming with a controlled pass game where players are making yards after the catch. So I might throw McKitty out there as another candidate.
Connor, how about a quick thought from the offense about the offense from you?
If I had to put money down on a breakout guy, I think Burton is a name that makes a lot of sense. I'd feel totally comfortable betting on Blaylock. I think if he doesn't tear his ACL, I think he goes on to have a pretty significant day against LSU there. You certainly saw that in the first quarter where he was getting open against that LSU defense, and Jake missed him pretty badly on one throw. And then, unfortunately, the other one, he picked up a third down and then hurt his knee. I think he would have had a big day that day and then continued that against Baylor. Again, Jeff had a great story this week about sort of he's had to come back from a serious injury in the past in his sophomore season of high school and came back and went right into the season, had a great year that year. Obviously, Mike is correct in bringing up the concerns about, working with Jamie Newman, but I just have such confidence in the player and person that Blaylock's going to be to where if I did have to pick a breakout player, a guy that sort of joins Pickens in that elevated status, I do think it'll be a guy like Blaylock. And you look at it, if you look at what Monken has done, both as a play caller in Tampa and then last year as an offensive coordinator with the Cleveland Browns, he's gotten good production out of those slot wide receivers. Adam Humphries had a very good career in Tampa Bay, and then Jarvis Landry last year topped 1,000 yards receiving for the Browns. So I think the slot receiver position, as Jeff points out, is something where you could see it either be Burton or Blaylock take on a bigger role in the Georgia offense.
By the way, Jason Hester on YouTube predicts Darnell Washington to have 8 touchdowns. This is one heck of a prediction for the incoming freshman. That'd be quite a high total for a Georgia pass catcher at any position. One final thought for me on the offense, then I want to look at some of the guys that Georgia's going to be doing battle against this season. It's important to know in the ranks of needing to break out, the Georgia running game is still in that group that needs to break out. We don't really have for Georgia a given sure thing in that running back spot in any of the areas. Now, you can make a case for a lot of the guys, but it's important to note that even the guy that I think most people would assume is the leading rusher for Georgia, Samir White, is at this point in time not much of a known commodity because he didn't play a ton a season ago. So if we're making the list of guys who better break out, my gosh, speaking as a fan for a moment, I certainly hope that White's on that list because otherwise, even in a Georgia offense that I think throws the ball more this year than it has at any point in time thus far in the Kirby Smart era, you're still going to have a potent running attack. And if Samir White is not one of the breakout names, is not a guy that becomes household known by a lot of fans around the SEC, then Georgia's probably got some problems there.
Brendan, the one thing that I don't know yet, and I think it's okay to say you don't know these things yet because you don't have the filter or the prism of spring ball to kind of look through. But I think one of the casualties of whenever football does return in certain pockets of the country this fall is tackling. I think fundamentals are going to be awfully hard to replicate, or it won't be worked on at all. And then plus nobody's want to go live with their guys a lot during the fall because everybody's just trying to get them ready with other areas. I see a name like Kendall Milton, and I see a name like Milton being very, very hard to get on the ground, especially if he's 230. He runs with some of the authority that he showed in high school, tackle breaker, tackle popper. He's going to have weapons, especially in an RPO game around him where nobody can focus on him like they did at his high school back out in Fresno, California. I just think, folks, another name that I don't know if people really say, probably one of the 3 or 4 less recognizable freshman signees, even among the esteemed Beat Corps reporters at the University of Georgia. I don't think a lot of people know the name Dejon Edwards yet and how he's really kind of like a poor man's DeAndre Swift in terms of how he can pick up blockers, how he can catch the ball out of the backfield, and he can run between the tackles. The only thing he's missing is he doesn't have that blinding 4.5, 4.4 speed.
I want to change the subject here for a moment, look at some of the names to know for the teams that Georgia will play this upcoming season. You're watching the Cover 4 live here on Dog Nation's Facebook and YouTube pages. My name is Brandon Adams. You just heard from Jeff Sintel. We've got Mike Griffith, Connor Riley with us as well. Let's look through the Georgia schedule for a moment. Let's highlight a couple of these names. Connor, let me begin week 1 versus Virginia, assuming that game is played. Some of the stuff coming out of the Commonwealth leads you to wonder if maybe they're not quite so sure about that up there for right now. But there's a storyline that I think has not gotten quite as much attention as I probably would have expected it to. Bryce Perkins was such a big part of the Cavaliers offense a year ago. He's obviously gone. But Keyshawn Thompson, former Mississippi State quarterback, is in Charlottesville now. He's a graduate transfer. I think he has 2 years of eligibility remaining. Listen, he's not a great quarterback, so I don't think Georgia fans will be quaking their boots by facing him. But he is a guy with some SEC experience, and I'm assuming if this game's played in downtown Atlanta to begin the season, that's the guy across the field lining up as quarterback against Georgia. I'm surprised that transfer has not gotten more discussion than it's gotten.
Is he eligible right away?
I believe he's a graduate transfer.
If he is, then that is something to note. Obviously, I think he's in a similar boat with Jamie Newman, where it's a new system for him. And while, yes, he did play some at Mississippi State, he did not have necessarily the same level of experience that even Jamie Newman had at Wake Forest in terms of a reps standpoint. And, with Thompson, he's run so many different offenses in his time at Mississippi State. He probably came in there thinking he was going to play for Dan Mullen in that offense. Then he transitions to Joe Moorhead. And then Mike Leach comes in and sort of just that's the end of the way with Thompson and him wanting to play. He is going to want to run around, and Bryce Perkins did just that for Virginia a year ago. But I think Perkins is one of the more underrated players in college football from last season and what he was able to do for Virginia. He had a pretty good day against Florida in that Orange Bowl, even though they weren't able to win. So I think it is something to watch, and that's probably a game where, you talk about this a lot. If that's a game, Georgia-Virginia, that's played at the end of the season instead of the start of the season, you would probably think Virginia is certainly a better opponent if they're playing them in November than they are to start September.
Mike, how about fast forwarding to September 17th against Alabama? Who do Georgia fans need to know about? Who do they need to be worried about against the Crimson Tide?
19.
Yeah. One thing I'd also add to what Connor said, they do bring back 3 linebackers that had double-digit tackles. So I'd be more concerned about the Virginia defense, particularly with Georgia's inexperience and a new scheme on offense. But to me, it's Najee Harris. I think if you can take away the Alabama run game, I think Georgia wins that. I really do. When I say take away, that's probably a bit much. Let's say contain the Alabama run game, because I think Najee's special. I thought he was special 3 years ago. Frankly, I'm surprised he hasn't done more to this point in his career, because when I watched him in the second half against Georgia at field level, I thought this guy was on his way to being a superstar in 2018 and 2019. I recognize there's a lot of competition for carries, but he's clearly the bell cow back. Can he evolve into a Derrick Henry sort of guy? Probably premature for that, but he certainly has the build. He's big, he's physical, and if he can bring balance to that offense, that's going to spell trouble for Georgia. But I've got questions. This Georgia defense, I just said a few minutes ago, they were loaded up front. I know that it's going to be strength on strength. Alabama probably has the best offensive line in the league. We don't know who their quarterback is yet. We know they still have some dynamic options on the outside, but to me, it's Najee Harris. He's going to be the key in that game for Georgia.
Jeff, I think that Najee Harris is the most interesting player on the Alabama roster for the simple standpoint. If I didn't see an Alabama team a year ago that was committed to running the football, Harris is coming back, stands to reason they'd probably want to use him. But I don't know that that's necessarily a given the fact that I think I've seen Alabama evolve into being a bit of a finesse team over the last couple of seasons. Harris is back. It's a name to know. Do you think that Alabama's going to lean on him in that game against the Dogs?
I don't think so. Because I remember, if we want to spend time talking, we could do a whole show about threats and weapons to watch on the Alabama roster. I can think of LeBron Ray, the defensive lineman. I can think about Byron Young, the defensive lineman. That's just going to be restock, and reload for Alabama. I think Jalen Waddell is a name to think about there. Everybody's got to remember Tre Sanders as well, who was set to do some pretty good things for the Alabama Crimson Tide. Wanted by the Georgia Bulldogs is basically all you can say there is the number 1 running back in the 2019 class. There was some late juice about him possibly going to Georgia as well. I think about that name, Jalen Waddell. To me, I think he's as explosive as any player in the country, as fast as he is, and the way he's going to make the new quarterback, who I think it will eventually be Bryce Young, and maybe even Bryce Young by the time Georgia plays Alabama in Tuscaloosa, whether it is in mid-September or mid-October. I think that's a name to think about there. But Brandon, I did some homework on this topic. I got to go back and this is something you guys will look at and you'll say, Jeff, what are you smoking here? But I got a name, Joey Blount out of Virginia. Joey Blount had 95 tackles last year for the Virginia Cavaliers. He had a couple of sacks. He had 3 interceptions. Joey Blount out of the state of Georgia. I knew him very well. I saw him very well. I saw what he could do. Joey Blount, I'm going to tell you this, folks. If he was in the Georgia secondary right now, he would be contending for a starting spot right now for the Virginia Cavaliers. That guy's that good.
You're really high on Blount, aren't you, Jeff?
Very high on Blount.
Very good. Yes, very good. Connor, any other names from Alabama you want to mention before we move on?
Yeah, I'm stunned that we have not heard either the name of Dillon Moses, who obviously he's coming off an ACL injury that cost him all of last season, but the man of 2nd and 26 himself, the former Georgia commit, Devontae Smith. He's certainly another one of those dynamic wide receivers. While he might not have the physical attributes that Jalen Waddell does, who is the Seth Rogen, he's the fastest kid alive. Devontae Smith is a really good wide receiver. And Mike mentioned strength on strength. How that Georgia secondary matches up against Alabama's wide receivers, I think, is going to go a very long way in determining the outcome of at least the first and if not the second of those games.
Yeah, my thing about Moses is similar to what I said about Harris a moment ago. I saw defense be less important in Tuscaloosa than I think it's been in any year of the Nick Saban era last season. Moses was obviously hurt, and that impacted that. I'm wondering if Moses' healthy return makes this feel like a defensive team again. There was a lot of Big 12 in the way that Alabama's played in the last couple of years. Now, for the most part, it was successful, including beating Georgia in the 2018 SEC championship game. But this is nowhere near the same kind of Alabama team that was first established under Nick Saban. For the better, change on offense. I would say a change for the worse on defense. How much do you think Moses, Connor, returns Alabama to what its roots were originally under Saban?
I think it's a significant addition, but I don't know how much it totally changes from what we've seen Alabama become over these past couple of years. I don't believe that with the defense, I buy into the whole, it is not a one-man show. It is a true 11-man unit. And the reality is that last year, while that Alabama defense still had a lot of talent on it, Raekwon Davis, Xavier McKinney, guys who were top NFL draft picks, the reality is that defense took a step back, and part of that, I think, is because of the playing style that they've now become accustomed to. And with a guy like Bryce Young, I don't think they're going to change how they play on the offensive side of the ball. I think they're going to continue to just say, hey, we're just going to try and outscore you. And I think that puts your defense at risk. And while, yes, it does have a little bit perhaps more talent this year than it did last year, I still think of this as, Alabama's going to be a team that wants to outscore you than a team that wants to hold you to 0 points.
I want to move on and look at Saturday, October the 10th for a moment against Auburn. There are two names to know, I think, here. And when I mention names, one of the things that's going to come up for me is near misses for Georgia in recruiting. And in some cases, they may come back and haunt the Dogs a bit this year. Also, ironically, both these guys have pretty cool nicknames as well. When Georgia plays Auburn for the first time this October, in the month of October, I think that Tank Bigsby looms large on offense. And after a couple of years in which some big names have emerged the Auburn defense, this defense this season, in a lot of ways, could belong to Big Cat Bryant. And that's a name I think you've got to be very well aware of if you're Georgia. So that's it for me. Two guys that were, at least in some form or fashion, linked to UGA recruiting. Both chose Auburn. This could be a big year for Big Cat. Obviously, Tank Bigsby will draw comparisons to a lot of other running backs anytime he gets a chance to go play Georgia.
Hey, Brandon, I've got a name, and it's kind of revolved around the similar themes. Young man by the name of KJ Britt out of Oxford High School. That was a guy that at one time probably thought he was going to go to Georgia in the 2017 class. He was as highly rated as a lot of those guys Georgia brought in. I think he was second team All SEC a year ago. And, man, you keep going on to those threads about Auburn guys that almost were Bulldogs. And I think Owen Pappoe actually played pretty well there for Auburn last year as well. But the names for me that bring up the scare factor for Auburn, you wonder what Chad Morris is going to bring. You wonder how many wrinkles he'll have. But, I'm not saying that Patrick Nicks will be a future All SEC quarterback, but I think he's going to be in the conference. Yeah, Patrick Nicks' son, Beau Nicks. Well, Patrick Nicks was on a few All SEC team ballots, but I would say that Beau, he's a guy that you like what all the repetitions and the looks and the reps that Beau Nicks got in big games last year. Remember how well he played against Alabama, how well he did against some good spots against some very good teams on an SEC West schedule. Auburn's offense and Beau Nicks, they're going to be better off for it. So I think as Auburn's quarterback goes, Beau Nicks, I think so will go that team this year.
Yeah, I think that Nicks is probably set up for a better season. I think he improved over the course of last year. And I guess I'm in a little bit of a minority on this, including a lot of Auburn fans that I've heard from. I think that Chad Morris hire is a positive for Auburn. I'm assuming that Gus Malzahn gives him some room to operate. My guess is that Auburn will be better for it. Mike, when you look at the Auburn roster, what jumps out at you and what should UGA fans be aware of there?
Yeah, I'm dating myself here a little bit. I actually covered Pat Nicks at Auburn, so I know the Rainbow City quarterback quite well. And And I think his son will have a legacy career. I mean, it was Beau Nicks that snapped that impressive streak Georgia had of not allowing a rushing touchdown all year long. And now you could say it was because Kirby and the defense backed off a little bit in the fourth quarter. They were pitching a shutout through 3 quarters on the Plains. That was pretty darn impressive. Seems like everybody's forgotten about the Georgia defense. I say everybody. National analysts like Danny Cannell that want to say it runs through Florida this year have completely overlooked that play of the defense. But Beau Nicks is a guy that should scare you to death because he is a legacy player. He's been playing his whole life with his father's legacy over his head. Not only does he fear it, he embraced it. You saw Peyton Manning go to Tennessee instead of Ole Miss. Beau Nicks comes through the front door at Auburn, which I think is the hardest and hottest job in the SEC, playing against Alabama every year. And yet still they beat Alabama 2 out of the last 3 years by double digits the year that the Crimson Tide took the back door into the playoffs. So with a guy like Chad Morris and the offensive mind that he is, with the kind of guy like Gus Malzahn, with the revenge factor working against Georgia, Beau Nicks is a guy that I think should scare Georgia fans to death.
Connor, how about you when you look at the Auburn roster? What do you see there?
I want to see it from Beau Nicks before anointing him. There were a lot of people last year who going into the season thought Beau Nicks would be a really good player. And the reality is that was not, I think what we saw. Yeah, they got admittedly very lucky in a week 1 win against Oregon. And from there, you did see some struggles. I know he had the rushing touchdown against Georgia, but for large portions of that game, he really struggled. And as far as the Chad Morris thing, I've never been particularly as high on him as some other people have been. And, with Gus Malzahn, to BA's point about Morris taking the reins, yeah, that's going to be the case until Gus Malzahn comes in and steals the keys out of his pocket and starts driving the offense once again, which is what Malzahn has shown time and time again as a head coach at Auburn, what he's done. And I think with this Auburn team, to Jeff's point, I think it's going to go as far as Beau Nicks goes. And if he elevates his game, I think they're a team that can certainly win the SEC West and possibly the SEC. But I want to see Nicks do that, and I want to see Malzahn give Morris control of the offense for a full year before I actually believe it.
I guess kind of the only thing I'll disagree with you on is that clearly at the beginning of the year, Nicks had a ton of problems, the way that actually most true freshman quarterbacks going to have in the SEC. We have a tendency to remember the best, and we kind of forget the rest. But by the end of the year, I think that Nicks had proven himself to be a solid starter. Maybe not all SEC caliber quarterback. I don't know that he'll ever reach those heights, but there are a lot of SEC teams right now that would kill to have a true, proven, solid starter. From that standpoint, I think Auburn's is at least a dangerous team because you are coupling what I assume is going to be a good defense again, although they did lose a lot, with what is at least a solid starter. I think I give him more credit for his solid, if not spectacular, play than you seem to want to do.
I just looking at some of his stats, I know yards per attempt is a big thing you like to look at. After the Arkansas game last year, and Arkansas wasn't even an SEC team a year ago, the final 6-7 games of that Auburn season, Beau Nicks didn't have a yards per attempt over 8, and actually it got lower and lower as the season went along. And he and that Auburn offense, I know bowl games aren't everything, but I thought they had a chance to make a sound statement going into next year about beating Minnesota in that game. And I think all of us here agree that Auburn is a more talented football team than Minnesota. And the reality is Minnesota pretty well handled Auburn in that game, I think. And I think that's maybe why I have some reservations about Auburn in 2020.
Let me move on to Florida here for a moment. And listen, no one's a bigger Gator hater than me. I have fun with that. I'm totally honest and open about that. However, even I can admit this. Florida has put together potent secondaries most of the recent seasons. I think that's also true again this year. Obviously, Marco Wilson gets a lot of attention. But once again, an example of a recruit that kind of got away from Georgia, a factor when Georgia plays. I think that Kyer Elam, also in that Florida secondary, is really a name to know. So I'll pair Wilson with Elam. And admittedly, when you do battle against Florida, you have to be very well aware of that secondary. Honestly, the loss of Grenard Zuniga, I think, creates a lot of problems in the Florida front seven. But the secondary stands to be pretty good again. And I think that Wilson and Elam are once again names you got to know. Mike, what about you on the Florida roster?
Yeah, I had Elam down as one of my players to watch. He was a painful one that got away from Georgia. I know when the Bulldogs hired Charlton Warren, they were hoping that maybe he could swing him their way. It was surprising to me that he couldn't because I got a lot of respect for Charlton. And listen, I'm going to jump on the bandwagon. Kyle Trask, if he's still healthy, This is a pretty poised guy now. They weren't able to get in the end zone until the fourth quarter, and they had negative rushing yards through three quarters, only 175 total yards, and yet somehow the road goes through Gainesville next year, according to Danny Cannell. But Trask is a guy that inspires confidence around him. Kind of makes me wonder how Mullen didn't pick him over Felipe Franks to begin with, if he's such an offensive genius. And yet, still, it took an injury to Franks to get on the field. So I like what I see. I like what I see from Kyle Trask. I think he's poised. I think he's waited his turn. Is he a big game quarterback? Remains to be seen. But to me, if you can get to Trask, then you drop Florida. LaMichael P. Ryan is gone. I've got questions about their run game. If you can't run the ball against Georgia, you're not going to beat Georgia, period. Even LSU had to establish some form of a run game to have success. So that was why I mentioned Najee Harris against in the Alabama game. If you're not balanced against this Georgia defense, though, forget it. So I think it's going to be a long day for Trask, but I still think he's probably their most dangerous offensive weapon.
Jeff, you got a thought on Florida?
Yeah, I think for me, sorry to sound not so high on the Florida quarterback, but I think it's a different Kyle. I think it's Kyle Pitts. I think that's the tight end that really made Florida go and really made Kyle Trask go last year. This will be his third season in Gainesville. I think he had like 50 catches a year ago, 600 yards, a handful of touchdowns, maybe 4 or 5. That's the Gator to me that is going to be very hard for Georgia to match up with when they do have to throw the ball. I agree with Mike's point that it's kind of like the Auburn game again. Everybody remembers Patrick Nix. Remember Patrick Nix had to throw the ball 50 times against Georgia because they knew that they weren't getting anything on the ground. And Mike, I give you a shout out. I like that term legacy quarterback. Because a lot of people think that, obviously the meaning there is that his dad played at Auburn and he's a legacy player. But I also like the way it means going forward about a player that will leave a legacy at the school. And that's instead of saying icon, which I know sometimes it draws some red flags from our production staff or whatever. But for Florida, stay on point with Florida. The other name to me that gives a danger Will Robinson type factor to me is I think they've got a Trayvon Walker type defensive tackle in this freshman class in Gervon Dexter. I think he's going to be that good for Florida. I think he's going to replace a lot of that interior losses from a year ago. And I think he's going to be a nemesis for Georgia for the next 3 years in Jacksonville or, according to Mike, maybe a couple of years down the road, maybe in Athens or Gainesville.
Jeff, you mentioned Pitts. As a Gator hater, I had to laugh the other day. He was on Instagram talking about he was leaving Gainesville to go travel to train somewhere, and his caption on his picture was like, leaving Gainesville, not turning back or something. All the Florida fans thought he was transferring because they've had a good bit of that here lately. Kind of find out that was not the case. He later had to go on and correct himself, but I thought that was funny. Connor, Mike Gay on our Facebook comment section mentions the losses for Florida. A lot of wide receivers gone from the program, probably most notably Van Jefferson. The absence of a real proven running game. How much does Lorenzo Lingard show up for you in terms of a name that Georgia fans ought to be aware of? Is this the 5-star that we thought he was coming out of high school, or the, I'll be polite and say, lightly used player he turned out to be at Miami?
Well, I believe he's coming off an injury, and I'm not certain on his eligibility for next year because he is not – I do not believe he is a graduate transfer. So we'll have to wait and see if he's eligible for there. But the point that Mike brings up, again, to beat Georgia, you've got to run the ball somewhat consistently or at least be able to move the ball from that standpoint. And with Florida, I still don't know if they're going to be able to do that. Like Michael P. Ryan was a good running back, but he did almost next to nothing against Georgia. And I think, this year without a guy like him, they didn't bring in a talented running back. As we know now, they missed out on Zach Evans this week. So the questions they have at running back are why perhaps Florida won't be able to make that leap from, winning 11 games a year to winning 12 games a year and playing for an SEC East title.
So, listen, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to try to get in some of these over-unders. We're knocking on the door of an hour mark here. Why don't we save the over-under stuff for next time and just finish strong on this? Did you give me a name, Connor? Anybody from the Florida roster that you're interested in? Pitts is an interesting name. I would caution about expecting really big things from Gervon Dexter right away, just because if you look at the history of especially interior defensive linemen, anything over 3 sacks is considered a really successful season. And, Trayvon Walker, as much as he did last year, he only had 2.5. That's right.
So I wouldn't expect him to replace the double-digit sacks that Jonathan Grenard had or the 6 or 7 that Jabari Zuniga was good for every year. So, again, I think with Mullen, he's going to do more with perhaps less talent, but at a place like Florida, that's not necessarily the recipe you want to be working with.
Jeff, let's talk about South Carolina for a moment. This is obviously a revenge game for Georgia this upcoming season. And once again, keeping with my theme of guys that Georgia just missed out on in recruiting, we're going into year 3 of Rick Sandage at South Carolina as a defensive lineman. Up to this point in time, Sandage has not really been an impact player for them, but I'm curious to see if the light really comes on in his junior season. One of the things you'll hear me say a lot over the course of the offseason is, putting the game against Georgia aside, I think this is actually a much better year for South Carolina. My expectation is this team wins 7 or 8 games. And if they're better along the defensive line, if a guy like Sandage were to emerge alongside a guy like Zack Dickens, then all of a sudden at that point in time, you really are talking about a much more difficult team to deal with. What do you think of Sandage going into year 3 at South Carolina?
Yeah, I think he's got to maybe it's funny, Brendan, how a lot of times we know about these players because they were good enough to be on the list for Georgia, and they were guys that Georgia were kicking the tires on. I don't think Sandage will be that maybe so much heartbreak guy that went to South Carolina.
Well, I will say, though, you hear from a lot of Gamecocks fans, they have not given up on him yet.
Yeah, I don't think giving up's the right term. I just think when I think of the impact Carolina guy that could have been a Bulldog, I think of Zack Dickens. I think that's the guy that I think they're hoping will slide into that Kinlaw role. I think he's a guy that showed some good film and some good tape last year for the Carolina Gamecocks. I do think that they'll be better. You got to remember that guy, I think, still intercepting Jake Fromm right now, the Israel, the 6'4", 6'5" cornerback as well. Makaramu, I think that Mukwamu. Thank you, trusty beat writer, for the interpretation and the recall on that name. You had to write it like 6 times in the game story, right?
At least, yeah. It'll be in the preview as well.
But to me, Carolina, I got 2 names, Brandon, and it's not Josh Vann, who was another guy that flirted with Georgia at wide receiver. I think it's the 2 names. I really like Ryan Olinsky. I think Olinsky was a guy that if you told me a year ago, if you'd rather have the 3 or 4 years of Olinsky or the 3 or 4 years of Beau Nicks, I probably was going to take the 3 or 4 years of Olinsky, especially now when you've got a pretty good offensive mind in the conference and Mike Bobo to pair him up with. You also got to remember the name Marshawn Lloyd, a guy that's going to be one of the best running backs Carolina has had since Marshawn Lattimore.
Yeah, Mike, I think the name of Lloyd
Marcus.
I think the name of Lloyd is a really interesting one because, as you know, South Carolina's big issue has been an inability to run the football. Lloyd's one of the best running back recruits they've had there in a good number of years, and my guess is they'll plan on using him a lot. That's the other name that comes up for me, the freshman running back Marshawn Lloyd, because if that team under Mike Bobo can find a way to run the football, and I guess you'll insert your own jokes if you're a UGA fan, but if they do run the ball under Bobo, I think that becomes a very dangerous team for a lot of other programs in the SEC East. What jumps out at you about the Gamecocks?
I'm kind of the opposite. I think this is going to be a really tough season for Will Muschamp. When I look at their schedule, and I know we're going to hold off on our over-unders, but I think this could be the last season. I think beating Georgia probably saved Will Muschamp's job last year. I don't see good things ahead. And, you bring friends together and things can go really good, but if things don't go really good, it can get really bad. And so I'm foreshadowing a very difficult season in Columbia, South Carolina, and perhaps, Will Muschamp, being fired at the end of the season, if not earlier. So, the cornerback with the 3 picks, Israel Mukwamu, as I mentioned, he's the guy to look for, although I really don't think that Georgia's pass game is going to be going downfield much. I don't think they're going to have to. You lose Javon Kinlaw and Brian Edwards. Those were 2 great players. Kinlaw was a first-round pick, and even though Brian was, I believe he went maybe in the 3rd or 4th round, he was their all-time leading receiver. If he doesn't catch that 46-yard pass, the only 40-yard touchdown or 40-yard gain that Georgia gave up the last 7 regular season games, it doesn't happen. And without Kinlaw and without Brian Edwards, and without, of course, Georgia 3 picks and 2 missed field goals. So I think Georgia's going to absolutely demolish South Carolina next season.
I don't deny that Muschamp was certainly hanging on by a thread at the end of last season. However, he did survive there, and I feel pretty confident in my pick. Not against Georgia. I wouldn't expect South Carolina to do well in that rematch, but against the rest of the SEC.
Guys, Does correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't Carolina grab both LSU, A&M, and Clemson, and Georgia, and Florida this season? That's a lot right there, man.
They play A&M every single year. That's their cross-division rival, permanent. They do play at LSU this season, at Clemson. They're also at Florida as well. So keeping with recent tradition, it seems like South Carolina and Auburn end up playing about two of the toughest schedules in the country every single year, partially because they have to play Clemson at a conference. So once again, you're talking about a year in which Clemson plays an incredibly difficult schedule. You are right to point that out. After playing Alabama a year ago, they're at Death Valley this upcoming season. So the cross-divisional opponent for South Carolina, the league off has done them no favors in each of the last 2 years. All right, let's talk about Tennessee here for a moment. I want to mention this, but the Vols, I feel pretty confident saying this. I think Tennessee on paper is the best offensive line that Georgia will play in the regular season. And Trey Smith gets a lot of the attention there. We don't yet know about Cade May's status. My assumption is he probably won't be eligible. Obviously, guys like Wanya Morris you got to pay attention to. I also think about a Brandon Kennedy, who was a former transfer coming over from Alabama. That's the kind of player you have to have in your program when you're first getting started the way that Jeremy Pruitt did. I think this is a very, very good offensive line. And while I'm a little higher on South Carolina than some of the experts, I'm probably a little lower on Tennessee in terms of matching expectations. But their best chance to do that is finding a way to run with this offensive line. So when I think about names to know, I do think about the offensive line, and I'll add Kennedy into that group of probably more famous guys like Smith, who's almost a surefire first-rounder, and obviously the recruiting names that Georgia fans remember. I think when you put Kennedy into that mix, you're putting a deep, talented, veteran offensive line for Tennessee. And if you're Georgia thinking about playing Tennessee, I think your conversation about how you game plan against them begins and ends with the offensive line. Connor, how about you on the Vols?
Well, I actually think you look at Tennessee and they remind you a lot of what Georgia's offense looked like. It could look like in 2019. Georgia had, I think, one of the most hyped up offensive lines going into the offseason, but they lost a lot of wide receiver production from the year before. Tennessee only brings back 30% of its receiving yards from a season ago.
Yeah.
They bring back Jerrod Carrington, who's done some things as a quarterback there, but he's certainly not even on the level of Jake Fromm, much less than that. They have some nice players at running back in Ty Chandler and Eric Gray, but I think as great as this offensive line potentially could be for Tennessee, if they don't have the wide receivers to make up for it, I don't know if this offense is going to be able to do the things that it needs to do for Tennessee to sort of take that next step under Jeremy Pruitt.
Yeah, I certainly agree about the difficulty of taking the next step. Mike, you know Knoxville well. That's a town that you called home for a long time. What do you think about the Vols and what should Georgia fans know about them?
Well, I mean, one thing with Trey Smith that we got to get clear. I mean, this is a guy that has a very rare blood clot condition, and what will COVID-19 protocol be for Trey this coming season? He would probably be considered in a. I guess I don't want to speak on it. I would want to know more about how Trey's doing. He's a guy I know quite well. He's a real linchpin. He's a real team leader, a guy that they really rally around. So he's very important to the Tennessee Vols, and his condition and if it is or isn't affected by COVID-19 would be where I would start with that preview. Not as impressed with Kennedy, and really Cade Mays is now going to be in a different environment. Where he was at Georgia competing for championships. Now, the bar has been lowered in terms of what's celebrated and what's good, and that's just where it's at when you're in a program that's rebuilding. So I think Cade has a chance to be a leader. He had that opportunity in the Sugar Bowl. I guess I would grade his performance in the Sugar Bowl as adequate, but not great. So I'm a little hesitant to say that Tennessee could be the best offensive line in the SEC. And to Connor's point, you still got to have players getting open. Jerrod Carrington is a guy that I covered from the onset of his career. He's grown a lot. He's been through a lot of battles. He's got to win on the road against a ranked Auburn team. But we know that Jeremy Pruitt has had a pretty quick trigger at quarterback. It's almost like a bad marriage there, the bad domestic. When is something bad going to happen again at quarterback? They've got all these other options. They've got an important game against Oklahoma early that I think will make or break their season. If they beat Oklahoma, yeah, that's a team to worry about. if they get beat, then there'll probably be some changes on the field and some disruptions. So Henry
Can
Toto,
I stop you for a second, though,
Yeah.
Mike? What I think is pretty funny about that is my take on that's almost the opposite of yours. I actually think on the road at Oklahoma is a sneaky winnable game for Tennessee. I think they're going to struggle in some other games. FPI favors South Carolina, for instance, over Tennessee. FPI calls the Kentucky game somewhere near a toss-up. I think it's really interesting for Tennessee that between the big games they play, the Georgias, the Alabamas, the Oklahomas you'll put on that list, Florida, I think they have a chance of actually potentially pulling an upset as about a 10-point favorite in Norman. But I think beyond that, winning some of the games that Vols fans probably view as easier wins, I don't know those games are quite as given as the average guy dressed in orange probably thinks.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, Kentucky brings back a lot on defense, and that was a close game last year. And certainly, Tennessee, they judge their coaches on what you do against Alabama, Florida, Georgia. And, I can't really pencil in any of those as victories. I do think they've got a shot against Florida. But the expectations when you win 6 games in a row and you have the number 2 signing class in the offseason, albeit as a result of volume, there's going to be a lot of expectations, man. And I've been in Neyland Stadium enough times when it's been a pressure cooker, and it can be tough. So it's going to be an interesting season in Knoxville. They need that win at Oklahoma to get some momentum and some confidence. Otherwise, this is the type of season that could unravel quickly.
Jeff, do you think that Harrison Bailey eventually overtakes Jerrod Carrington this season? Is he that good in your mind?
I kind of think remains to be seen on that one. I think Garantano's just simply game reps and experience are going to go a long way. I don't know if the noise meter is still going up with the needle about JT Daniels in Tennessee right now, or if he's expected to go somewhere else as a graduate transfer. I'm talking
but
about.
He is not a graduate transfer, though, right?
I think he's
Daniels just a third-year player, I believe.
He would just be a transfer.
Yeah.
The lines get muddy there a lot now with transfers because everybody.
Now, if LA is in a perpetual lockdown since, then maybe he's got a hardship case. But as it stands right now, he's not a grad transfer yet. Yeah,
but he's leaving that program. I think the thing I want to know from you guys really quickly, just one word answers. Who is the most likely SEC East loss for Georgia? What does everybody think here?
SEC East. I mean, if you're going to keep it to the East, you'd have to say Florida, but I don't think Georgia's losing that game. But if you're going to limit it just to the East, you got to say Florida.
Is it still Florida? Is that a yay for everybody around the horn here? Everybody would say Florida. So I guess with Tennessee,
I guess I don't get to make a point.
Well, I looked at you. I thought I saw a nod from you, Connor. Please continue.
Given when Georgia plays South Carolina in the season, I think that game could be interesting.
Wow.
I think if they get that offense righted and figured out under Mike Bobo, who I have a lot of respect for as an offensive mind, I think that game could be interesting with the way South Carolina's defense is sort of built.
Yeah, I don't mind being very clear about this. I think that Mike Bobo is a difference-making hire. As a fan, I am hopeful that Monken can be as good for Georgia as I assume that Bobo will be for South Carolina.
You guys are grossly underestimating. This reminds me of when people said Vanderbilt could make it interesting for Alabama this year. Do you not remember them tearing the hedges apart? Do you not think these Georgia Bulldogs will be absolutely loaded for bear and these Gamecocks will be beat down from the schedule we just discussed? Interesting in the way of 5 or 6 touchdown loss, maybe.
Well, I'm not picking South Carolina to beat Georgia. I'm just simply saying that I think that Bobo is a difference-making hire for them. I do. And I hope that Monken proves to be as valuable for Georgia as I assume that Bobo is going to be for South Carolina in terms of transforming that offense, given what he has to work with there.
So Brandon, the context of why I threw out that straw poll about the highest odds of Georgia taking an L in SEC East Division play was because I think although Tennessee is not the team everybody thinks has the most fear factor for Georgia this year, it has quietly became the school that's like, oh, yeah, that guy. When you think about Tennessee and what they have, there's the name Alontae Taylor. There's the name D'Angelo Gibbs. There's the name Cade Mays. There's the name Wanye Morris. And there's the name Aubrey Solomon. It's almost like the ghosts of didn't work out at Georgia past with a lot of these guys on the roster. I mean, I don't know. We all wish the best for these players when we move on. But what if D'Angelo Gibbs moves into that role where he's kind of catching some of that production that those 2 great receivers that Tennessee lost a year ago to the NFL draft? I'm talking about Jennings and Callaway. What happens if D'Lo becomes a guy that's in there? And there's Aubrey Solomon on the defensive front, and there's Cade Mays as a starter on the offensive line. And, Alontae Taylor is the starting cornerback for that team. There's a lot of history there with Tennessee that kind of makes them, I would say, a unique foil there for the Georgia Bulldogs moving forward.
I wish Gibbs well. I was a fan of his when he was at Georgia. I loved him coming out of high school. I do think he's a long way away from being what Tennessee had for receiver position a year ago. And the fact of the matter is, I don't think Tennessee's going to be very good this year. I think it remains to be seen what the next few years look like. I just don't think Tennessee's very good. As I said before, I think it has a good offensive line. From that standpoint, you got to give that part of it credit, but that's not enough to make the team good. I don't think that Georgia-Tennessee will feel like a very big game by the time it's played, because I don't think Tennessee will have held up to its end of the bargain for making it feel like a big game. That game being in November for Tennessee this year is going to be a huge letdown, because I think by the time it gets there, there's a lot of juice missing from that game. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. I do think, again, I'd go back to that Oklahoma game as the barometer for the season. And, I like what Jeff said there, and I would carry that over to the coaching staff. I mean, look, Jim Chaney's up in the box, and, they know what Georgia's going to do. They know that the last 2 years they've known that they were leading Georgia in the first half last year for a reason. I mean, Jeremy Pruitt knows how Kirby plays. He's been a part of his staff, worked for him. I still, though, I believe come November 14th, that's a game a lot of people turn off at halftime and go to bed, because Georgia should be rolling by then. Not sure who's going to be under center. I would guess Jamie Newman, but, Carson Beck, Juwan Mathis. I mean, this is an offense where they're going to play different quarterbacks, and you hope that Jamie Newman can stay healthy through the grind of a SEC season. Wasn't able to do that in the ACC. But I think it's a game Georgia wins handily, and most people are going to bed at halftime after watching the Masters earlier in the day.
Connor, go ahead.
I'd just like to point out that Mike has George Pickens and Jamie Newman not playing every game this season. When this goes wrong, when this Georgia season goes wrong, everyone knows who to blame here.
The curse of Mike Griffith.
Get in resistance.
That's not a curse. I think they can win without either one of them. I think they can win without George Pickens. I think if George Pickens left the team right now, Georgia could still win.
Now he's kicking George Pickens off the team.
You're going there. I'm just saying I don't think any one player off of this offense is indispensable. Defensively, you might have a case there's a few guys, but offensively, there's so much newness, so much young talent. I like the new offense. I think Jamie Newman is very important. But my point is this: Georgia has good depth at quarterback, and I think there's a lot of young talent at receiver. I don't think they're going to – even though I think Pickens will have a 1,000-yard season, I don't think he's going to play all four quarters of every game in the regular season. I'll go on record with that as a prediction.
Connor, I want to get a thought from you on Tennessee, because Jeff mentioned some pretty interesting defensive names. They got a lot of talent there. It's amazing to me, though, all the hype and attention, I would say I certainly was a part of this, giving Derrick Ansley when he came into the SEC. It seems like Jeremy Pruitt hurt some feelings by the way that he was installed as defensive coordinator, and yet I can't hardly think of any impact that Ansley's actually made on this league as of yet. Is this defense led by Ansley, is this a game-changing unit for the Vols this season? The talent's there. Ansley was a big name, but is he a good defensive coordinator? I honestly don't know.
I think it remains to be seen. Tennessee doesn't have, they lose Darrell Taylor from last year. They don't have that sort of dynamic standout pass rusher. Henry Toto, I think, is someone who is sort of the Tennessee version of Obie Dean, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of leap he makes. But the reality is, I think we've seen this in the last couple of years with the Georgia defense, having a good, solid defense can win you a lot of games. But the big question with them is they are not operating at that same talent and depth level that Georgia is. And do they have enough difference makers, as you point out, to really, I think, be seen as one of the best defenses in the SEC?
All right, as I said before, we were going to do over-unders. We're already like an hour 15. Let's save that for another time and just get ready to wrap up here for today. Any other names or any other thoughts as we go out the door? Mike, I'll let you go first here.
I just, the news today that the SEC presidents are going to be voting on a June 1st or a June 15th return. I mean, to me, this is a leap and bound. I had been projecting a July return, and yet we've got a story up on Dog Nation where the June 1st and June 15th dates are being discussed. And whether you think they're going to vote yay or nay, the fact that it's even going to be tabled tells you this is moving quickly in the right direction. West Virginia President Gordon G. saying there will be a football season even if I have to suit up. The man is 76 years old. So to me, that momentum is good momentum for college football, and hopefully we continue our positive momentum in the state of Georgia. So those are kind of the things that are on my mind moving forward, BA.
Connor, how about you as we say goodbye here? Anything else you want to bring up today?
I'll give you one over/under. Over/under 7.5 push-ups from Jeff Collins during the Georgia Tech game this year.
I'm going to take the under. Push-ups. Yeah,
I'm going to take the under, and if I could actually parlay it, I would maybe take the over on Kirby Smart push-ups head-to-head against Jeff Collins.
I don't want that. I like the idea of Collins regretting ever acting like a fool on that sideline a year ago, but I don't want Kirby Smart to acknowledge it, even though it's kind of fun. Honestly, jumping in the stands and doing the Rocky Top stuff in Tennessee is one thing. That's kind of punching at your weight class. Tennessee's an SEC program. Georgia Tech is not. So I would prefer Kirby Smart not even indulge. That's my own personal take there.
Probably what you want to see. You just want to see him shake their hands and leave out of there before any extracurricular activities break out in that rivalry game.
Also, I know Tech's desperate for talent. If Gordon G really is putting a uniform on, Tech may be interested. Jeff, how about a final thought from you?
Final thought from you. I hear birds chirping in the background. So that means we're almost at the close of our program. I'm going to say this. One, I'm about to go fishing with my kids. So I hope everybody, I wish I could take everybody on this team and everybody out there to the fishing hole with my kids. But quick over under. In a fishing contest, folks, I want the people on the feed to vote. Which one of the four of us is coming away with the most fish?
Probably not me, although I'd like to be a better fisherman, but I'm probably not. I'm guessing since you're setting it up, you must think that it'd be you.
No, not at all. I just like fun banter among the group.
I'm guessing Connor's never been fishing. Mike seems like he probably would have.
How dare you?
I'm going with Connor.
We have a lake in our neighborhood, and in the summer, from time to time, we used to go fishing back there. I mean, I haven't done it in a while, but I've been deep sea fishing. I've been fishing. It's not my favorite activity in the world, but I guess somehow the answer is me, even though I am the farthest thing from a big fish guy.
I think Connor would find an app and then he would research the right lures. I think he would put more into it than anyone and win, because I think by far he's the most competitive guy among us.
I don't know that Mike is a fisherman, but if it came down to finding something in the woods to kill and eat, I sort of think that Mike might be the best at that.
See, what Mike would do is he would say he wouldn't have the use of his best rod and reel for the entire fishing trip.
Yeah.
That it would break and snap, that he wouldn't be able to fish with it appropriately. He'd have to go without his best lure in the meat of the competition, and that's what would happen.
Well, listen, Jeff, we hope you have a good time on your fishing trip. That's a great thing to be doing today. Connor and Mike, to you as well, and to all of you tuning in for our Cover 4 broadcast here today. So before we got a lot of fun stuff planned for next week, we'll do the over-under stuff and a lot more UGA stuff there as well. Make sure you keep it close to DogNation.com over the course of the next couple of days. Read all the really cool stuff at the site, and go back and visit the Dog Nation video channels. Mike this afternoon had a chance to catch up with former Georgia coach Mark Richt. That was also a really fun conversation, too. I'll see you tomorrow morning and 10 a.m. for Dog Nation Daily, presented by Kroger. We'll have a good time to close out the week tomorrow, and see you again here very soon for the Cover 4 broadcast as well. You have a great afternoon, everybody.